and go on. So this class, again, we've been trying to tie the Old Testament, Genesis and now into Exodus, to what we see in the New Testament, how that plays into who we are and what we understand of God's plan for us over time. So turn over to your Bibles, if you've got those there, to Exodus. And if you remember back in Exodus, in chapter 1, we kind of have the description of the Israelites who went down to Egypt, went through that process. Hopefully he covered this already. How Joseph, with his brothers, kind of multiplied the numbers there. They were very successful, very fruitful, multiplied greatly. But then Joseph passed. And when that happened, the new king, the new rulership there in Egypt did not remember them and started to oppress the Israelites, started to put them into more slave situations and made it difficult on them. They kept growing, though, despite all this. And so the Pharaoh's, the king of Egypt, kind of got a little worried that they would become too powerful to control. So he started to talk to the midwives about letting the boys die and the young babies, the female babies, to live. And at the end of chapter 1, it says that when Pharaoh gave this order to all people, every Hebrew boy that is born to you must throw into the Nile, but every girl let them live. And so this kind of paints the picture here of what the scenario was going into Moses' life, what he came into, this more of oppressive situation with his people. Chance that he wouldn't even make it before they even started, because all the boys were to be taken out. And it reminds you of some other scenario where another young male child was born and might not have made it because of the king's fear of obviously Jesus. Matthew 2:16, when Herod realized he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, gave the order to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and the vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance to the time he had learned from the Magi. So Jesus and Moses kind of had a similar start. So if we start into Exodus 2, starting at verse 1. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that it was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, because trust me, 3-month-old boys are a handful. Crying all the time, and that can be difficult. Anyway, we could hide him no longer. She put him in a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch, then placed the child in it among the reeds on the bank of the Nile. His sisters stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down Nile to bathe. Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe. The attendants were walking along the riverbank and saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slaves to get it. She opened it and saw the baby, and he was crying, and she felt sorry for him. One of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? And yes, she said. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter and became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of water. I believe Moses, the term for Moses is drawn out. It made me think of the word for the church, which is ecclesia, the called out. So we're both called out, drawn out. So being born into the tribe of Levi, Moses kind of sets this stage for the Levitical priesthood, obviously starting off with his brother Aaron. And it seems like as you kind of look through Scripture, and definitely in this scenario, that water plays a huge role in salvation. In Moses' case here, he was saved because of the water and the little bassinet boat that he had. Later in his life, he's saved by water. Can you think of what happened later in Moses' life, that water became Huh? Yeah, parting the Red Sea, obviously, and then also getting water from the rock to save them from thirst. So 1 Corinthians 10:1-2. So for I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses, into the cloud, and in the sea. So, of course, water through our baptism we partake of as part of our salvation as well. So we have Moses now raised in the house of Pharaoh. So he had all the education, all the privilege, all the benefits of being royalty. Um, and although he was a Hebrew, he was raised right there with Pharaoh's own children. It gave him the experience and the know-how of being in the palace, in the courts of the royalty. Stephen, if you'll turn over to Acts 7, we'll be flipping back and forth between the Exodus 3 account and also Stephen's account when he was preaching right before he was stoned in Acts 7. He says in verses 20-22, at that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him, brought him as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in action. So this education that he got that was different than his fellow Hebrews was the thing that kind of set him apart. And we can see as we go through the story of Moses how this played a role in who he was, what he was able to do, and the abilities that God gave him through this action or through this first 40 years of his life. Because so it's ironic if you think about it that here's Moses raised by the Egyptians, family basically to them, and then the third part of his life when he comes back to Egypt, he's persecuted by these same people that he was raised with and that he identified with and was trained by. They were then going to be his oppressors and going to go after him. It reminded me of someone else in the Bible that kind of went through the same thing as a messenger to the people. Who do you think that sounds like? John the Baptist. Okay, good. Who else? Paul. Huh? Jesus, prophet has no honor in his own country. Absolutely. Yeah, he was raised and taught through there. But Paul, obviously, as well. He was raised at the feet of the most learned men. He says in Acts 22:3, I'm a Jew, born of Tarsus of Cilicia, but I was brought up in this city, studied under Gamaliel, was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you all are today. And then Philippians, he says, though I myself have reason for confidence, if anyone else thinks that they have reason to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, people of Israel, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law of Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church; as for righteousness based on the law, faultless. So he was raised a Jew. He was Jew of Jews. He was, and then had to be the messenger to come back that was persecuted by his own people, just like Moses. And of course, Jesus, like I said, he was obviously in the same situation. Moses leaving Egypt now, as we start in Exodus 2, he was around 40 years old and had grown up. And he went out into his own people. We don't really know how much interaction he had with the Hebrews, with the Israelites at that point, how much education he had on their background and the history and the religion. How much did he know about God? We really don't have a good picture of that in the early part of Moses' life. But in Exodus 2, verse 11, he went out to his own people and watched them at their hard labor. So he started to have some affection or some connection to them. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And the next day he went out to 2 Hebrews fighting and asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? And the man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me like you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid, thought, what I did must have become known. And of course it had. Stephen kind of describes it this way in Acts 7 when he says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought, this is an interesting verse too, and Acts 7:25. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. And the next day, Moses came upon the two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers, but why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed him aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Were you thinking of killing me as you did the Egyptians?" So you can see a change in Moses. He knows he's not an Egyptian. He tries to go back to his own people. He tries to help them out, but he feels rejected by them. So what feelings do you think he carried with him further when he ends up leaving Egypt, about where he is in life? Exactly. Yeah. He's just in isolation. He's not an Egyptian anymore. He can't get back into the courts because of what he's done. He can't get back into the palace, but yet he can't get back in with the Hebrew people, with the Israelites either, because they've rejected him. They don't accept him either. So he's a man without a country, literally. So in Exodus 2:15, sure enough, Pharaoh heard about this and tried to kill Moses, but he fled and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water, fill the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. So it seems like Moses, from what we've seen so far, fairly fit guy, probably. He had good nutrition and good diet in Pharaoh's home. He had probably training of some kinds, because he took out this one Egyptian and now ran after these shepherds that were giving the daughters of the priest of Midian a hard time. Of course, they could have been little boys. We don't really know, because shepherds were pretty young back then. So might have just been some young boys. But anyway, he did have that control and that physicality, it seems like. So who is this priest of Midian? We know what the priests are going to be down the road, but who is this priest of Midian? What's that? Yes, but a priest. Who called him a priest? Who named him a priest? What religion was he a priest of? What other priests do we know of that have been mentioned before? Melchizedek. So we've got a kind of another example of a priest he wasn't a Hebrew. Jethro was not a Hebrew. He was not of the descendants of Isaac, but he did worship God, and he was a known religious leader of that area in Midian. And so Moses agreed to stay with him there in Exodus 2:21. And he took his daughter Zipporah in marriage. And Zipporah gave birth to a son, named him Gershom, which means I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. Once again, I don't have a family. I don't have a land. I don't have a country. I don't have a people. Pretty isolating feeling. And while he was there in Exodus 2:23, during that period of time, the king of Egypt died. And the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out for help because of their slavery. Went up to God, and God heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he looked on the Israelites and had concern about them. So we know God is not short concerning his promises. We know that. He remembered his vow to Abraham. He remembered what he had told him about taking care of his descendants and making them a great people. And as Dan has pointed out, they went down as 70 and came out as millions. So he did that in that process. It was a hard process, but he built that people into a large, powerful group of people. So Moses begins the first 40 years of his life as royalty. He's taken care of. He's got all the best nutrition, we said, education, training, surroundings, pretty comfortable life. And now he begins the second 40 years of his life as a shepherd. So you can kind of see, in retrospect, and as the overview we have of how Moses was prepared for the tasks that God had prepared ahead of for him. The first 40 years prepared him to be able to go back into the palace, go back into the royal courts to be able to know how they function, know how to talk to a king, know what the protocols were. Regular shepherd up in Midian wouldn't have known that, or Hebrew wouldn't have known that. Regular Hebrew wouldn't have known that. He did. He was prepared for that. The second 40 years of his life, as he's up there in the wilderness protecting the flock, kind of got him toughened up a little bit. He might have been a little soft in the palace. Now he's out there in the wilderness in the mountains taking care of the sheep. He's getting stronger. He's getting more used to being in the outdoors, which is going to be what he's going to be doing for the next 40 years after this, kind of preparing him those different stages of his life. So as we go through different stages of our lives, and there are different things that we don't understand why we go through certain things and why things are where we're exposed to certain people or certain things. And you can go back later in life and go, okay, I see that now. I can see that God was teaching me, preparing me, teaching me what I needed to know because of this person he exposed me to, good or bad, because of this job that I had that I didn't really like, because of the people who are around me. I now can see what that meant. And that's just faith. That's having faith in the process that God has that plan for us. And so we have to kind of remember that in every situation we're in, God has a plan and he has a purpose for us. We've just got to work through that with faith, because that we can see retrospectively how God prepared Moses for this. So we have the story in Exodus 3, 1 through 4 now, where God approaches Moses about the task and the job and the responsibilities he's going to give him. And in verse 1, Moses was tending the flock of Jethro's father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Stephen's account, again, if you have that in Acts 7, 30 through 34, again, after 40 years had passed, we have a time frame here that we didn't have in the original text. So Moses is 80 years old at this point. An angel appeared to Moses in the flames of the burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight, went over to get a closer look, and he heard the Lord say, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. And the Lord said, take off your sandals, for the place you're standing on is holy ground. I indeed have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. So Moses is obviously content to be where he is. He figures this is going to be the rest of my life. I'm 80. I'm a shepherd here in the mountains. I'm fine to stay up here. This is great. And then he encounters this unusual situation. And remember, again, that's been a period of 400 years that God has not been in contact with his people. He's not been talking to people. So this is not our usual thing. This is not a typical thing. This was something that, had to have been a little bit difficult for him to process at first. And so, we kind of give Moses a hard time sometimes of being reluctant to listen to God and reluctant to do what God says, and comes up with all these excuses, which we'll get in here in just a little bit. Just have to remember the frame that he was in, and the mindset that he was in, and what he had come through, and the lack of the involvement that God had had up those last 400 years. It seemed like a long time, obviously. So he says to him in verse 7, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians, and to bring them up to the land that in a good and spacious land, flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. That doesn't sound like a very good country if it's full of parasites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Again, I'm just a shepherd. I've left that life. That's way long ago. I'm not anybody to approach him. It's not me, not me. And Stephen, again, kind of describes it the same way in verse 35 of chapter 7 in Acts. This is the same Moses that they had rejected with the words, who made you ruler and judge? And he was sent to their ruler and delivered by God himself through the angel who appeared in the bush. So again, he's got this mindset of, these people rejected me. I tried. I kind of gave it a little effort. I tried to get to know them, tried to help them out. They didn't want me. Why would I go back? What's the reason that I'm supposed to go back there? But God had a different plan for Moses. And one of the favorite verses is Jeremiah 29:11. And you all know this, this verse. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. And we have that. That's the great promise that we have from God, that he has plans for us. They're different. Each one of us have a different path to take. We have different things that we go through through life. Thankfully, we can go through a lot of that together and help each other out through that plan and through that path. But God has a plan for each one of us, and it's a good plan if we'll be faithful. So, despite his resistance, despite his reluctance, despite his insecurities about going back, God tries to reassure him. And in verse 12, he says, I'll be with you. And this will be the sign that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Remember, they're on Mount Sinai. And Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, what's his name? Remember, it's been 400 years. Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. The I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and the name you shall call me from generation to generation. So they're going to be a little suspicious. This guy shows up who used to be royalty, used to, kind of walk around on his high horse while they were working, and he comes back and he says, hey, I'm gonna take care of you now 40 years later after he left. So they had a lot of reluctance. They had a lot of questions, I'm sure. And, if you think about it, the same period had passed from the last time God had spoken. God intervened with the Israelites 430 years roughly. From when Malachi, the last book of the Bible chronologically, and when Christ came on the scene, roughly the same period of time. So 400 years passed between those two episodes of when God spoke to his people. And so just like when the Israelites would have been questioning God who, when Christ came to this earth, there was a lot of change that had happened. A lot of the religious leaders had done things differently and had taken things in a different direction. And it took the signs and miracles of Christ to be able to show that no, this was God sent, this was God ordained, just like we'll see here with Moses. So Stephen kind of ties these two stories together in Acts 7, 36, 39, when he says he led them out of Egypt, performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, parting of the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness. There was just one sign after another to try to convince these Israelites, this is the real thing. This is God, not just me. This is God who's taking care of you. The manna, the water from the rock, all the things that he did for them, the serpent on the brass serpent on the thing to cure them of the snake bites. And in 37, he said, this is Moses who told the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people. He was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us. But our ancestors refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected him, and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. So just as Moses tried to save his people, to try to give them the words of God on the stone tablets, they rejected him. They turned back to Egypt. They wanted to worship the golden calf. And just like they rejected Moses, when Jesus came at first, they rejected him, obviously. And these words of Stephen are the ones that they got him in trouble. Obviously, he's telling the story. He's telling what happened. He's trying to tell them what they did to Jesus, and that's when he ends up getting stoned. So we go back to Moses and trying to convince him to go to Egypt. And of course, he came up with every excuse he could think of. But each time he did, God had a way around that excuse. God had a way that he said, I hear what you're saying, but I can take care of that. So if you look at Exodus 4, when asked to go to Egypt, Moses answered, well, what if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? The Lord said, okay, what's in your hand? He said, a staff. So the Lord said, well, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground and became a snake, and he ran from it. And the Lord said, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took a hold of the snake, turned back into a staff into his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand in his cloak, and when he took it out, his skin was leprous. It had become white as snow. Now put it back into your cloak, he said. Moses put his hand back into the cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, if they do not believe you or pay attention to you, the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, then take some water from the Nile, pour it on dry ground, and the water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. So pretty impressive, pretty neat signs, pretty cool little ways of them showing this is not me, this is not coming from me, this is coming from God. And we know kind of what will happen later, kind of foreshadowing the plagues and the things that are going to happen. But despite that, despite Moses just seeing what has just happened, Moses tries to come up with excuse number 2. So in verse 10, he says, well, pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been that eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Well, if that was true or not, I don't know. He just wanted to use that as an excuse. And the Lord said to him, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak. I will teach you what to say. You know, I think oftentimes when we're in those situations where someone is interested in talking about God, someone wants to hear about Christ, that's the excuse that we give. They're just not eloquent. I just don't know the words to say. I don't know how to approach this subject with this person. It's an excuse, obviously. And God has given us his word. Now, we do have to go through it. We do have to learn it. We do have to memorize it. We do have to put it in our hearts. We're told to do that. But as far as the eloquence, the words will be given to you what to say. The situation will arise in those workplaces, at school, and those situations at the gas station, at restaurants, where people will be anxious to hear about God. But we have to have the ability, the strength, the lack of fear to speak to them about God. So after that, Moses says in verse 13, just pardon your servant, Lord. Just please send someone else. You know, first he said, Lord, here am I. When he said Moses, when he called him out, then he goes, oh, you want me to do something? Yeah, send somebody else. I don't want anybody else there. So now, after all these excuses, obviously, the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And he said, what about your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he'll be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will help both of you speak and teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if you were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take the staff in your hand so you can perform the signs with it. So if you don't feel comfortable talking to someone, but you know someone who needs to hear about God, take somebody with you. Find somebody. There's plenty of people who will be willing to do that. But it takes you to connect that person, those people together. And that takes the strength. It takes the looking for those opportunities. And it takes the ability to reach out to that person and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about God. Can I bring somebody with me in case you have any questions that I just can't answer? That's fine. You just need to be able to do that. So despite his reluctance, Moses went. Obviously, we know he has a very special place in history. He was very special to God. I mean, God appeared to him in the burning bush. God met him face to face on Mount Sinai. God let him see his face. And when honoring his son, when he was in Matthew 17:2, when he was transfigured before them, Moses was there. In Matthew 17:2-3, there he was transfigured before him. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before him Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. You can imagine what that was like. Jesus transfigured there, honored by his Father, and who's with him? Moses and Elijah, and they're talking. I'd love to know what they were talking about. Be able to listen in on that conversation. So Moses, again, didn't think anything was special about him. We know that it was. God knew that it was. God had him prepared. What's special about you? What's unique about you? Because there is unique gifts, there are unique talents, there are unique opportunities that each one of you all have that no one else has, that God's going to use, can use, if you'll let him. You know, we have all through Scripture of people didn't have a whole lot, seemingly have a whole lot, but God used it to his glory. We have the story about the widow who had just enough oil and flour for one cake. Remember that story? She made it for Elijah. They made it through the famine. Just she, her son, and Elijah had cake, had enough for every day, just that little bit. We have Rahab just had a rope. That's all she had, but she saved the Israelite spies. Little David just had 5 smooth stones and a slingshot. Look what he did with that. The little boy had 5 loaves and 2 fish. Not very much, but he used it for God's glory. And you can see what happened there. The widow gave her last 2 pennies. I mean, we have all kinds of stories in the Bible about people who seemingly didn't have very much, but they used it with faith, through faith, for God's glory. And were blessed by it and blessed many people around them for it. So what are you holding in your hands? Do you have a staff that you can use? You don't have a staff? What about a car? You have a car that could be used? Someone needs a ride? How about a phone? How many of you all have a phone? Who doesn't have a phone? Unfortunately. There's a lot of people who just need a call, need a text, need a word of encouragement. Easy to do. Everybody's got that ability. How many of you all have friends, family? Those opportunities that we don't know, those people that need God, but you know them and we don't. How many of you all have a computer? You can reach out through an email, to be able to send people information on God, on the videos that we present here that Jed works on every week with Dan to be able to teach. We have things in our hands every single day that we use either for good or for evil, or not to use at all. And we have all kinds of excuses that we come up with of why we can't use those for God's glory. So we need to be open our minds, open our hearts to those opportunities and be able to see with spiritual eyes the needs around us. We can obviously see this. We can take care of physical needs really well. We're good at that. And you all are very, very generous with that. And we appreciate that so much because that opens doors. It does. But there are a lot of spiritual needs out there that we need to be reaching out for and looking for. I've told you all this before, and I'll take another opportunity as well. We're looking at restarting small group ministry. We like to call it connection groups. These are going to be different than what we've done before. Before, we had fairly uniform groups that would meet together and study God's Word. It was great. We had great fellowship and great learning opportunities. But what we would like to do in this concept, and we'll be presenting more about this in the near future, is to get you all to look at your gifts, to look what you've got in your hand, to look at your passions. What unique things has God given you? And there are many others who have those same passions in this congregation. Let's get you all together in these connection groups to use those gifts for God and to find opportunities to be able to reach out and serve. It's one of our three things we'd like to present on a regular basis, that we want you all to love God and be here to worship Him. We want you to love His Word and be in it on a regular basis. And then we want you to share the love. And it's sharing the love that we can accomplish through these groups by using your talents and gifts. And they're all different. I've used this before, but in 1 Corinthians 12 through 22, just as a body, though one has many parts, but all its many parts form one body. So it is with Christ. That's us. We were all baptized in one Spirit as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free. We've all been given one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one, but many parts. Now, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. Or if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts of the body, every one of them, just as He wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. You all are indispensable. We need every functioning part to function, to work in what it does best for our body to function properly. The verse that we would like to use to kind of remind you of these connection groups, or to unify these connection groups, is Ephesians 4:15 and 16. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Him who is the head of, that is Christ. From Him, the whole body, joined and connected together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. Moses didn't think he was worthy. Moses didn't think he had the abilities to be able to lead a whole nation out of slavery. But God knew otherwise. He knew what he had. He knew what He had prepared him to do. And he was able to, through his strength and through his power, accomplish that goal. But it's going to take us to be able to identify what God has done for you all, for your gifts, for your abilities to be able to be utilized to help us build up the body and to strengthen it and to grow it and to be able to reach out to others around us. So be thinking about what your gifts are. Be thinking about what your talents are. Be thinking about what your passion is, what you'd love to be able to do. We're going to have a lot of different opportunities, and each person's going to have a different role in those groups to be able to bring those together and be able to make them function properly. So finishing out then, Exodus 3, God then tells him in verse 16, just go assemble the elders of Israel and say, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have watched over you, and I have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you out of misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will say to you, will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and to say to them, the Lord, the God of Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go, and I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor, and any woman living in her house, for articles of silver and gold, for clothing, which you will be put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Now we know as the story goes on, It's the plagues. It's the plagues that God reaches out his hand and smites the Egyptians. And despite Pharaoh's reluctance, time after time after time, he finally relents. And what that's referring to at the end of chapter 3 is the fact that they're just so willing to get them out and let them go that they just give them stuff, that they take a lot of gold and silver and things with them as they leave, as God predicted, as God told them that would happen. So they ended up getting the upper hand because of God's strong hand and God's intervention with that. So any questions about that process? We'll probably stop a little early here and then let Dan pick up in Exodus 4 next week. All right, thank you all.